if there's one message, it's don't be shy, and honestly, if you don't know something, you don't know it. Big deal. You'll learn it along the way. I've never had a job that I knew how to do before I got it. So, that I think is a key lesson learned from this discussion.
If there's a tagline, it's "We are Gen Z, hear us roar."
I love it.
Exactly.
Welcome to Sustainability Decoded with Tim
And Caitlin.
On our podcast, we break down what's happening in climate, sustainability, and ESG.
And along the way, we help you get smarter about sustainability. So let's get into it. We're halfway done with our first season, and to reflect on the industry and what we've learned, we've brought on my fellow Gen Z Persefonites, Anissa Vasquez and Kevin Stephen. Tim's calling this our Get Off My Lawn episode. I'll let him decode that one for once.
It's yet another reference to me being an OG in this space, but it's definitely a joke. I absolutely want these young people on my metaphorical climate tech lawn. Anissa Vasquez is manager of global ESG policy here at Persefoni. Kevin Stephen works on our sustainability strategy team and is an extern from Bain & Company, a Persefoni partner. Both told us about what drew them to work in sustainability and why solving the climate crisis is an incredible personal fight for their generation. On the show, Kevin and Anissa also share advice on starting a career in sustainability and even a few must-read books.
We've had a lot of fantastic OGs on the show, but for this episode, Gen Z is taking over. I played the role of both guest and host this time around.
So this is the episode where we talk with people who are of Caitlin's generation, right, Caitlin?
Yep.
20-somethings, sustainability, curious, want to help change the world. So perhaps we start with just a brief round of introductions and tell us about your bio. I heard this is the first time you actually created a bio for some of you, which is kind of exciting. But let's introduce our guest. What do you say, Caitlin?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we were just kind of joking before the podcast that, all three of us recently had to write bios for the first time. And we were kind of like, oh, okay, how do I write a bio when I'm
so young,
in my early 20s and have just started? And it's like, what do I write about?
I have some ties that are in the early 20s. So
Yes.
True story. Well, let's begin with Anissa alphabetically. Anissa, who are you?
My name is Anissa Vasquez. Glad to be on the podcast. I am in my first 5 years of my sustainability career. And yes, I did have to Google a bio template. Thank you. Prior to Persefoni, I coordinated the sustainability team at the global law firm Latham & Watkins. I helped to grow their ESG legal team, which is where I became inundated in the environmental, social, and governance world. Early in my sustainability career, so couple years ago, I was with the New York Public Interest Group, NYPIRG for short, knocking on doors, canvassing for New York State renewable energy legislation. And I also worked at Smorgasburg, for any New York listeners listening. That is the open air food market. And I was leading their zero waste initiatives. I graduated with an environment, sustainability, and policy degree from Syracuse University. And I'd like to describe myself as a Gen Z climate ESG advocate. This is very much my world, so glad to talk about it.
That is so cool. We actually, my wife was a NYPIRG door knocker too back in the day. So it goes way, way back.
Wow. Takes a strength. She must be a strong person.
You can compare notes over the generations. They've been doing that. Kevin, tell us a little bit about yourself and your very long and distinguished bio.
I'm Kevin Stephen. I am currently the Sustainability Strategy Associate at Persefoni. It's been a couple of years of working in the climate and sustainability space after college. I've been at Persefoni for a few months now, working on policy, regulatory, and product strategy, and especially helping to figure out how we can use policy insights to help drive the company forward and help drive product strategy forward and help build a new product, which has been really cool. And it's been an honor to work on Tim's team for the past few months as well. Before Persefoni, I worked at Bain & Company, the management consulting firm. And I was a general consultant working on a lot of private equity due diligences in spaces from technology to healthcare to financial services, really all across the board, and also working a bit in healthcare as well. But my true passion has always been in the climate space. Before Bain, I studied applied math and computer science in college, and I wrote a thesis in climate science, actually, and I've always been super interested in getting into the climate tech space. So I am definitely new to the space and have been learning a lot from the OGs like Tim here, but I'm super excited to keep learning and keep doing.
That's really exciting. And you went to DeVry, wasn't it? Isn't that the school you went to? No?
Yeah, I studied applied math and computer science at Harvard, graduated during the pandemic. So if you can really count that as a graduation, we actually finally had our graduation back in May. So they brought us all back to campus and we had all the pomp and circumstance of like a normal college graduation, which for my parents was a really big deal. It was their first kid graduating from college. So I'm sure it was great for them as well as it was for the rest of us to see us all in our caps and gowns finally.
I'm a fellow COVID graduate myself, and it was nice to like come back and see everyone and do the whole gown situation thing and walk down the aisle and all that stuff. But I can definitely say that it was more for the parents than it was for us. I can echo that sentiment, which is fun. But yes, congrats.
Congrats to you both. It's a once in a lifetime, super meaningful accomplishment. And I know that you said it's more for the parents, but someday you'll look back and say that was a pretty big deal. And it is a big deal. So fantastic. Mazel tov to you both. And Anissa, it wasn't that long ago for you either. So
I just missed the pandemic cutoff in 2019. Sorry, Kevin.
So since we're talking about sustainability decoded, and you each come from different schools of thought or basically majors within your college programs, but you've all sort of arrived at the same place at the same time. We're all working together at Persefoni. We're all working to essentially make the world a better place through our core competencies at this company. And it's just this unique moment in time to find us all here at the same time in the same place. But I'd love to just dive a layer deeper into what brought you to the field of sustainability. And for this, maybe, Caitlin, you can be more guest than host here because you're a Gen Zer as well and have a unique story to tell. So maybe if we sort of go around in reverse order and ask the now three guests, what really brought you or drew you to this field of sustainability? And I'm going to start with my co-host, Caitlin.
Well, I think I really started to tune into a lot of the issues that we were seeing in kind of like products I was buying in supply chains. And, I learned about like animal agriculture, for example, and was shocked about like what happened behind the scenes there. And so I was kind of almost like lifting a veil I had over me and my childhood growing up. When I became a teenager, I started kind of seeing the negatives and that veil was lifted. And I was like, oh, wow, there are so many problems here and so many things we need to fix. And then I read a wonderful book called The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. And that book frankly, it sent me to a existential crisis. And I didn't leave my bed for 3 days after finishing it. So not for the faint of heart. That book is very intense. He breaks down what the world looks like at each degree of warming, all the way up until 4 degrees. And the 4-degree outcome is absolutely terrifying. So from that point onwards, I was like, you know what, this is it. This is what I have to do. There's not even a question in my mind. That was the moment that I really committed.
Wow, what a story. I mean, we've been working together now for over a year and I never knew that. So I love this podcast because I always learn new things. Kevin, do you have a similar story?
Yeah, I would say so. I was born and raised in central New Jersey, which, if you know, central New Jersey is very green. And it was very much an outdoors upbringing. I was like a Boy Scout, Eagle Scout through and through. And so many of the things that I did when I was growing up were outdoors: the kayaking, the rock climbing, the hiking, the backpacking. And so I've always been someone super interested in nature and someone who loves to be outside, which has been tough living in Midtown Manhattan for the past year or so. But then when I was in high school, it was the era of cap and trade. Cap and trade policy was all the rage. back during the Obama years and trying to get that passed at a national level. Obviously, it didn't go through. But when I was in high school, I wrote a cap and trade bill for my high school's like New Jersey Youth and Government program. And that was my first foray into like researching something ESG/sustainability related and putting it into practice even at my like young high school level.
Cap and trade is a system where the government sets a limit or cap on emissions. Companies that pollute less than their allotted amount can sell or trade their leftover emissions to other companies. The system reduces emissions by lowering the cap annually, and the trading part also incentivizes companies to cut emissions.
And that got me super interested into climate policy. And I had always been curious about how the cap and trade policies could affect, or the sustainability policies could affect climate change and then climate change mitigation. That was probably the second thing that kind of drew me into the climate world. And then the real like nail in the coffin was after my junior summer of high school, I got the opportunity to participate in a program called the New Jersey Scholars Program, which was this stay-away summer camp for nerds, basically. And the theme was climate change and the human experience. When I was in college, even though I studied applied math and computer science, I took every opportunity that I could to work on something climate-related and kind of keep that in focus or top of mind. Freshman year, I had my first real huge opportunity to do something in the climate space, and that was when Gina McCarthy, who was Obama's EPA director, after the Trump election, she got the opportunity to come to Harvard and be a fellow at our Institute of Politics. And by some stroke of luck, I was able to work for her for a semester. And that was like a super inspirational moment with one of the other OGs in the climate space, because she's been working in the space for years and years. And right now is at the Biden White House. I got to learn from her about climate change and public policy, and then went on to write my thesis in the climate science space. So I never really knew, and this is kind of a thread that's kind of carried into the rest of my life, I've never really known what I want to do in terms of, is it something more technology related? Is it something more math related? Is it something policy oriented? But I have always known that I wanted that thing to be related to climate. And I really think that goes back to the way that I was raised and like how outdoorsy and nature oriented it was. It was a very natural and logical progression of the thing that I wanted to work on in life coming out of my childhood.
That's fantastic. And I'm going to dive in on all of this to see how intentional it really is. But so far, two really amazing backstories. Anissa, you got a tough hill to climb here. How did you arrive?
A little bit opposite than Kevin. I'm a city girl from Brooklyn, New York, who really loved nature, but lived in the concrete jungle. The closest I got to greenery was the Leif Erikson Park nearby, where my family lovingly referred to the flower trail as Anissa's Trail because I was obsessed with it. I originally wanted to be a journalist. I was editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper. I wanted to do the voice for the voiceless thing, all that. Until I learned about the severity of the climate crisis. Kind of like you just said, Caitlin, when I learned how bad it actually was, when I learned about the 2 degrees Celsius mark, the 4 degrees Celsius mark, that was all I wanted to do from there. It felt like nobody in my immediate circle had any idea how severe this was talking about it at all. Of course, global warming, littering, these niche environmental individual actions, of course, came up every now and then. But the fact that nobody knew that this was a crisis was very eerie. I had a very similar response of kind of shutting down, and I couldn't shake it. But then I decided to make that what I did. I went to Syracuse for their journalism school. They have a world-class journalism school, but I completely did a 180 and I wanted to do this environmentalism, sustainability type work. They did not have that at the time. So I jumped into the closest major I could find at Syracuse, which was geography at the time. When I didn't really know what to do, I remembered a Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote when somebody asked her, what do you want to be remembered for? And she said, I want to be remembered as someone who used whatever talent she had to do her work to the very best of her ability. So that is what I try to do. Eventually, in time, Syracuse University did create a environment, sustainability, and policy major. That was really led by my advisor, Cher Abbott, who actually did work on the Clean Power Plan in the Obama administration. And by the time I was a senior, I was in the first graduating class of that major, and there was only 4 of us. So that is how I really got into this. From there, I did whatever work I could, whoever would take me, and the rest is history.
All right, we've got some unfamiliar names and book recommendations to run through. First of all, I recommended The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. Wallace Wells is a journalist who has written extensively on climate change. His book is about what research shows us will happen to the planet as it warms. Anissa just talked about her advisor, Cher Abbott. Cher is VP for Sustainability Initiatives at Syracuse. And of course, Kevin mentioned Gina McCarthy. She's currently the White House National Climate Advisor. Definitely an OG.
You guys are amazing. I mean, I'm being completely genuine and serious how inspired I am by your stories, because I've been around this space for so long, and each one of you dropped some major books that changed your life, some names I heard, the RBG, fantastic, Gina McCarthy, amazing. You know, some of these people that have changed your direction. I mean, it's super inspiring. And looking ahead, you know, when I compare your experiences and what's coming now to my experiences, 40 years ago or more, it's different. But there are some similarities. I want to dive into that a little bit. When I was a child, people were lining up to protest in the streets for civil rights. There was the very first Earth Day in 1970. There were protests against war. And now I look at what's happening in today's world, and my gosh, there's some real similarities. We just had a Supreme Court that made several precedent-busting decisions that will really change the fabric of American life and may have global implications as well. And so I'm thinking about your stories and how you came to this place full of passion, full of desire, trying to bend your careers into a way that will make change. What do you see going forward? I mean, how will your generation take on some of the challenges, especially now that those challenges are right in our face?
Yeah, I'm seeing young people, and even people as young as, 13, 14. As kids, we grow up and we have those rose-tinted glasses on, and, we see the world in a certain way. And then I think now as kids grow old, we kind of begin to question that. Like we're seeing really scary news and really scary predictions and outcomes of the future. And that kind of sets off the alarm bells in young people and kids that, they want this to change. They want to have an impact. And of course, everyone has many different skill sets. So they're hoping to, use those skill sets and tie into sustainability in some way, shape, or form. And so I think that's a really interesting thing. It's like, there is such an interdisciplinary focus on this as well, because we need all hands on deck.
If I could speak to 2 things that I've seen in our generation in relation to the climate problem. One is a sense of immediacy or urgency that I think was never really there in earlier generations, or the broad strokes of earlier generations. And the second is a distrust in existing institutions that are designed to tackle this problem. And for the first one, I think a lot of us have been raised with the idea that this is a problem that needs to be solved within the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. And if it's not, then we've basically hit the time stamp and we're too late. We're going to kind of fall out of the possibility of a 1.5 degree warming scenario. We get into the more extreme scenarios that Caitlin has mentioned. That's all research proven. And I think people in our generation definitely believe that and understand that. And for us, it's very real, because that kind of dictates how our adult lives go and how the lives of our children and the next generation go. So it's not really like a far down the line problem. It's a super urgent and immediate problem. And I think, Tim, I'm sure your experience of like living through the civil rights movement and seeing those protests early on must be similar to seeing now the young climate activists get on the ground now and fight for things. It's the same sense of urgency in that if we don't get this done now, it's going to be too late. And it's kind of a now or never situation. The second theme, and I think this has been reinforced by the recent Supreme Court decision on West Virginia versus EPA, is that existing governmental institutions, existing leaders in office, they just don't get it. And they don't understand the immediacy or the urgency that a lot of us have had top of mind for our entire childhoods. And there's like a broad sense of distrust, I would say, with institutions like the Supreme Court being able to understand the reality of climate change, and were institutions like Congress to be able to act on it quickly enough for us to make any actual changes. So I think those two things, the idea of urgency and the wide-scale lack of trust in established institutions to tackle our problems in society, are what's driving so much like grassroots support right now in the young climate space. And I think, as Caitlin said, it's all kinds of people coming together, whether they're engineers or people in politics, people trying to go into climate policy, people doing more STEMmy stuff, or people who write and like produce art. I think the idea that this is like an existential threat that needs to be solved in the next 1 to 2 decades is super top of mind for all of them.
West Virginia versus EPA is giving a lot of us eco-anxiety right now. The Supreme Court ruling limits the EPA's ability to regulate emissions.
Anissa, what are your thoughts about how this generation takes on these huge challenges?
Yeah. In addition to the urgency for Gen Z, for the younger generations, the climate crisis, it feels personal. It's a personal fight for us. I know we've all seen the numbers of, Gen Z being very mission driven, and it's just completely the case. I think we have a lot of fight in us. And in order to not get jaded, I think we're going to have to put those skills to use. And I'm glad, like Caitlin, like Kevin has said, we have a very interdisciplinary, a very diverse coalition of young climate activists to push that forward.
Growing up in this time and age is actually quite scary, and we're needing to kind of change the way we look at our own futures. And, there's a lot of grief that comes with that, right? Especially with reading a lot of sad climate news. And for example, the West Virginia versus EPA ruling that just happened was very scary. I guess, on a personal note, I want to know as well, how do you guys avoid climate burnout? Or how do you kind of pick yourself up when you're feeling that grief really weigh on your shoulders?
Personally, I seek community. I think there's so many of us that feel like this, finding the people that that are super into this. But I think a lot of us, not a lot of people they know are super plugged into the climate crisis. So if you don't have a direct support system, finding local communities that are doing like compost clubs or your city sustainability program is a great way to kind of just talk about it, seek community. You're not the only one feeling this eco anxiety. You're not the only one. I think second, personally, just unplugging completely with, to be honest, just mindless trash sometimes, whether that is, reading a fiction book, watching reality television. For all those who are so deeply plugged into the climate world, I am here to tell you that you are allowed to consume trash media if that is what helps you. And if I'm the one voicing that, that's something I accomplished today.
I love that. I'm a guilty reality TV watcher myself, but I think that's also true. It's like you just need to turn off. Also, I'll say reading a book, even if it might be kind of a weird fiction book, I still think is not something you should feel guilty about.
Exactly.
Do you ever feel that, Kevin? Do you get the doom overload sometimes?
I think it's definitely a temptation. And I think Anissa is totally right in that if you're working in either climate or politics right now, or climate politics or policy right now, especially, it's definitely a temptation to become cynical or to become jaded. And I know a lot of folks our age who have been about climate and also about the general state of society. I've always been raised to believe that cynicism is the antithesis of innovation and of progress. And like being jaded just means that you've kind of given up. And I never want that for myself. So I've always tried to stay optimistic in the face of struggles. And so what I've been doing to kind of remind myself of the progress that has been made is there's a lot of actually good like websites that have good climate news on them. And they show the progress that has been made on various climate fronts saving different species of endangered animals, or like building super cool climate technologies of like battery storage and renewable energy. And there's just been a ton of progress that's made all over the world that can help you find optimism and light even in times of setbacks and challenges. So whenever I feel too discouraged, I go and look at some of that like positive climate news. And I remind myself like why we're fighting the fight that we are fighting. It's because those things are worth saving.
Find the kindred spirits, find the good news, and when all else fails, reality TV. That's what I heard.
Absolutely right.
Pretty
right?
much.
Got it. One of the other observations from this conversation, which by the way, I'm getting a lot out of, so thank you, is that I mentioned, in my generation, you didn't have a lot of options. And so the view was, if things aren't going right, you have to go out on the street and change them. There's a little bit of a difference I'm picking up here. Maybe it's a big difference that your generation can actually make change through your careers. And that's big, right? So you don't have to be a regulator. You don't have to be a campaigner. You can go to work at a company like Persefoni and make change by using the core competencies you learned in school, which is tremendous. And I don't think those opportunities really existed in my generation. So do you agree with that point?
I totally agree, Tim. And I think there have been so many instances of this that I've seen even in the last few years. So working as a consultant at Bain, it's been the last 2 years that, for example, as a big 3 consulting firm, we have started to pick up on issues of ESG and see it as becoming more and more important for our clients. And what that means is that we've been building a internal ESG and sustainability practice to help build up like internal IP around climate stuff, but also that we've been working with clients on what their ESG needs are. And sometimes consultants are the canary in the coal mine in that respect, because if you see that happening at a consulting firm, what that means is that like the private sector is now, being more and more urgent in addressing these kind of issues at their own companies. So I've seen a lot more jobs pop up for young graduates working on like ESG analytics at companies. The climate tech space, like startups, are absolutely burgeoning. And since joining Persefoni, I've gotten requests from my friends asking people who had never been interested in the climate space before in the last like 6 to 12 months have been asking, how do I get into climate tech? How do I get into the climate space? And I think we're seeing, especially now, it's like super at an inflection point, the climate tech space is, and it's only going to continue, I think. So we definitely have this super cool opportunity of whether you are a more writing person or a more politics person or a consultant that works on PowerPoints all day or someone who actually has technical skills, there are ways to get involved in the climate space for people who are interested.
Yeah. It's no secret that a lot of Gen Z needs to be somewhere where their values are aligned. And if they are not where their values are aligned, they will leave. That's not the truth. That's not the case for every Gen Zer, but for a lot of us. And I think we're seeing jobs reflect that. My previous job was at a law firm. When I told people I did sustainability at a law firm, they completely didn't even understand what or how that was possible. But I think our generation, more than anything, is applying pressure on these companies, any type of industry, really, to get with the program, for a lack of a better word. And that pressure is, leading to jobs in this field, whether not only sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all that. And yeah, Gen Z is definitely flocking to where they see their values are the most aligned.
Super exciting. So applying pressure from the inside is what I'm hearing. You guys are getting jobs, and you've each had a couple of jobs now that you've managed to manifest your values within those positions. Has that always gone well, or has there been some hurdles, barriers? And specifically, what can you learn from folks like myself who've been through the business world a few times and might be able to assist you on that journey?
Yeah, one thing that I've learned working for Tim in particular is that a lot of working in the ESG space is about public and private partnerships. And Tim, you spent a lot of time, working for the government, like at the Senate, for example. And then, of course, a long stint in the private sector, which continues at Persefoni, but also included places like Apple, Intel, managing sustainability there. And a lot of the work that we do on our team at Persefoni is managing that interplay of public sector institutions like Congress, for example, making laws, the SEC, thinking about requiring companies to disclose, but also private/nonprofit institutions like the standard setters, the framework bearers that help guide governments to a better place, so to speak, or a more aligned place with climate policies.
I thought I would be out in the forest more when I was trying to save the world. I spent a lot of time in office buildings and running around to meetings. And it's hard because you don't get to sort of tangibly feel the outcome of your work. And you need that kind of feedback loop sometimes. We talked about this earlier about what do you do when you feel, climate doom. And I think we're all going to have to kind of find that source of renewal that gives us the fight to move on. But to your point, Caitlin, I always say this to my own kids, the soft skills are the hard skills. There are going to be so many different phases of your career, so many different jobs you're going to have, and none of them you will be prepared for. I always say, be willing to be the dumbest kid in class, ask a lot of questions, be curious, learn whatever you can, build relationships. It's these basics of things you learned in kindergarten that will help you through your business career. What are the things other than the soft skills that OGs can do to help you? I mean, I find myself in this great position right now, having worked in this space for a long time. And I actually was on a call with a young person that's graduating from college this August and trying to help him along his way. So I just always like to kind of find out what are the things that really would give you, and because we all work together, you have to be careful what you say, but what are the things that I can help you with in your career?
I think this is broadly, and Tim, you're doing it right now, so that's good, but giving voice to younger voices, to more diverse voices in the sustainability movement is absolutely crucial. There are a number of webinars, speaking engagements in the climate space. There are climate conferences all over the world where I think the seasoned vets are sharing their thoughts and their experience, which is incredibly helpful. And we need to hear the experience and the history to inform where we're going. But I think letting the younger voices and more expand audience of voices get a shot at those tables is always really crucial. We are going to be the ones that are living with the consequences. And frankly, a lot of us are angry. And I think we have a lot to voice in that regard. So giving us opportunities to share our perspective and our voices will be very beneficial for the climate movement in general, I think.
Yeah, I think, Tim, in the time that we've worked together, you've given me incredible career advice, graduate school advice, marriage advice. And it's been great, I think. And what we're seeing right now in the Gen Z climate space is a lot of people who maybe weren't super involved in the climate space or didn't have that idea growing up, who are now super energized. And as Anissa said, they have a lot of fight in them coming into the space, but maybe they don't have as much direction of where exactly to take their talents. And I think that's where a lot of the veterans and OGs in the climate space like you can kind of help guide people who are coming into the climate space for the first time, both old and young, by the way, and be okay, maybe you're really good at writing. Well, here's something that you can do to help the climate space from a writing perspective. Maybe you love people and are a really good connector of people and love speaking and connecting with people at different conferences or at rallies or on a grassroots level. Here's what I did 50 years ago or 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And this is what the climate space could use. I feel like people coming into the climate space for the first time have such little context on how to use all that fight and all that energy and how to channel it. And that's where, Tim, I feel like you've given me, for example, such great expertise and experience and advice by letting me follow you around and learn from you. And I think that's probably also what a lot of young people or people who are even not so young but entering the space for the first time could really use the most.
Wow, that is actually kind of touching, to be quite honest, Kevin. And I feel it from all three of you because, this is, a time at which you guys really have to step up. And I hate to say that, but your time is coming when you're going to take on these challenges. And I think, Anissa, you said it, that this is our generation are going to have to live with these problems. And if there's one message, it's don't be shy, and honestly, if you don't know something, you don't know it. Big deal. You'll learn it along the way. I've never had a job that I knew how to do before I got it. So, that I think is the key lesson learned from this discussion.
If there's a tagline, it's "We are Gen Z, hear us roar."
I love it.
Exactly.
I love it. We did talk about some of the kind of how you got here, but as you think about your very young lives and your amazing pathways so far, what are some of the things that you'd like to impart to the next gen? What are some things that maybe changed your perspective? What are some of those gems, those lessons learned that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I think one of the big misconceptions that I had, especially going into my college years, was that there were a couple main ways to work on the climate problem. And this is especially geared for my engineering listeners or my applied math or stat people, because a lot of our classes, they never really focused on climate as a problem. Those were always the policy kids or the journalism kids who really cared about issues and were super mission oriented. As a tech person or as a math person, you were expected to either do proofs and kind of get a PhD or go work at Facebook. And the point of my college career where that clicked was I was in an applied math class learning big data or linear programming for big data or something like that. Applied linear algebra, I think. And the professor who taught the class was both an applied math guy and atmospheric sciences professor. And for every linear algebra problem that we would have to solve, he would put on the board some super crazy application of that problem or that algorithm into things like modeling ocean currents or modeling storms that were impacting weather events or even modeling climate impacts. And that was the first time that I realized oh, wow, as a math person or as a science person, there are really concrete ways that I can now get involved in actually applying these skills into the climate space. And maybe it seems obvious in retrospect, but as a college kid or as a high school kid, it really wasn't. And really, no matter where you're playing in the private or public sector or somewhere in between, there are ways to incorporate sustainability and a climate-driven mission into whatever you're doing.
I totally second that. It's interesting to try and find your niche and use the skills that you've taken out of college or maybe not even college and just your other jobs that you've had or experiences you've had and try and use those strengths. Yeah, I did psychology at university and I was disappointed when we had, maybe it was a quarter of one lecture and the whole time I was there was about behavior change. And I was well, that's a huge thing. That's a massive industry as well. And I want to know so much about that. And kind of like Anissa said, I found a mentor as well who was interested in psychology and environment and did my dissertation on the barriers to pro-environmental behavior on an individual level, as well as what motivates people. And that was interesting. And then I finished my thesis and some of the researchers, my teachers really, they were do you want to publish this paper? I was what? No, I couldn't do that. That's not something I could do, right? I'm too young. I mean, we need young people. There's just a huge gap for a bunch of people to come and fill all of these spaces, and they need to be filled, and that work needs to get done. So I totally agree that the takeaway from this conversation is that, we need to develop that confidence to enter those spaces and learn on our feet and really grow in that way because they need us. And that's hopefully a positive message to end on.
It is.
We're not doomers. We've said that before, but we can't be doomers because it's our future. We cannot. We just can't afford that.
And if you're not completely confident, be completely terrified and do it anyway. You don't need to feel that confidence to go out and do. That's the definition of being brave. Be completely terrified and do it anyways.
I love that message. Is it fake it till you make it or no? That's
Yeah, I think so.
Same thing.
Yeah, it's always fake it till you make it. Totally.
Got it.
It's like the
got
first step is like the hardest one. And then you can kind of go from there.
Well, all I can say is working with all three of you and working with other young people, I'm consistently amazed that the kind of inspiration and observation you bring into the workplace. It's always new. It's always something different, always something unexpected. I learn as much as I provide. So I'm super thrilled to be working with you. Again, I probably learn more than I give. And what a great conversation.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. It was awesome.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Well, I just want to say a big thank you to Kevin and Anissa for joining us. I will say it's quite refreshing to have some younger guests on with me, so I'm not juggling between the worlds of OGs. But yes, it was wonderful to have them on. I just kind of wanted to note, Tim, on just the innovation that they both have. It's clear that it's so kind of ingrained in Gen Z as well, but specifically Kevin and Anissa, just being able to really think on their feet and have that confidence to, like we said, enter spaces where, young people may feel small, but you have to have that kind of courage to just stand in that space where you might be the youngest in the room and find your voice and say what you have to say.
Super impressive. And I'm impressed with you, Caitlin, because you kept switching between host and guest the entire time, as you are one of the generation we were trying to explore in this discussion. I think you were able to share your views as well. And some of the key things that came out of it were fairly clear about, lead from where you stand, bring that confidence, use your voice. But for me anyway, and I said this during the pod, but I'm just so inspired by young people who make sustainability a part of their careers. And it's even more than their career, it's a part of their existence.
Absolutely. Like we've said before, the younger generation can't afford to be hopeless. We just can't, because, how would we continue to live our life just jaded all the time, right? Like Kevin and Anissa bring so much hope.
Great episode. Caitlin, I love doing this with you. It's so much fun. That's it for this episode with Anissa Vasquez and Kevin Stephen.
To learn more about Anissa and Kevin, check out the links in our show notes. Before we go, please don't forget to subscribe to Sustainability Decoded with Tim and Caitlin on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. While you're there, it would be great if you could rate and review the show. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you in our next episode.
Sustainability Decoded is produced by our incredible team at Persefoni and Human Group Media. If you want to learn more about Persefoni and our climate management and accounting platform, please visit our website, persefoni.com.